Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today for a very special inquest. This inquest is a long time in coming. Sometimes legal processes can be very slow. It is alleged that a body is missing, the body of Jesus of Nazareth, and the year of the missing body is approximately 2,000 years ago. In the chair on the stage is Ian Powell. He has examined the evidence and he is of the view that the body of Jesus of Nazareth rose physically from the dead. And on your left is Barrister Martin Hadley, who will test and scrutinise this evidence upon which Ian has based this position. And on your right is Barrister Ian Davidson, SC, who is the counsel assisting Ian Powell. We're going to start this inquest with Ian Davidson asking a question or two to Ian Powell.
Mr. Powell, shortly in the tradition of the early church, you will be thrown to the lions and questioned by my learned friend Mr. Hadley. But before then, please explain succinctly to this jury why you believe the resurrection is history.
It's either history or a hoax. I believe it because I think reliable people explained what had happened to them. The early Christians were not saying, we have some views about God and life and morality. That's just to misunderstand what they were saying. They were saying, we have news about something that happened. So that you'll hear them in their earliest communications saying, you killed him, God raised him, we've seen him, or we are witnesses. And I have spent some time as a non-believer and then for 40 years as a Christian myself, exploring the evidence, coming back to it again and again, reading books against it, reading books for it. And the alternative seemed to be that either those first Christians were duped and deceived by someone, or they are deliberate deceivers. But either Christianity, which stands on only one leg, the whole thing stands or falls on the resurrection. And I find that the alternative views are weak. They look good often as a possibility because at a prima facie level, if I may use a legal word that I barely know the meaning of, the resurrection is of course, 2 words, thank you. The resurrection is of course absurd. Everybody knows people don't come back who are really dead. But the first Christians said they saw this once dead man and they were persuaded that he had defeated death. And I am personally persuaded that they are telling the truth rather than lying.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. Mr. Hadley will now ask you some questions.
So we are looking into allegations about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And one aspect of that, one part of your story is that the body was placed in a tomb on a Friday afternoon and found missing on a Sunday morning.
Absolutely.
Now, many aspects of Jesus' life, you'd agree, are more a matter of consensus than certainty. For example, some of the dates. Taking, for example, the year he was born, would you agree the consensus is probably more likely 4 BC than year 1?
Yes, he was born BC.
But it's too inconvenient to change all the dates, so we're going to stick with the 1812 overture rather than the 1816 overture. And
that's a good idea.
1984 is still 1984 and not 1988, etc. Yeah. Similarly, the year Jesus died, many experts opt for 33 AD, but you'd agree there are other possibilities that are seriously considered?
Absolutely.
At least 2 other good contenders. However, your story entails more certainty about the time of the year when these events occurred. That's true, isn't it? It's generally agreed to be around a Passover weekend, if I can use that expression.
Well, that's what both the hostile rabbinic sources say in the Talmud and the Christians say, that it was around Passover.
So the basic story is that the body was placed in the tomb on a Friday afternoon and found missing on a Sunday morning. And we're talking about an above-ground tomb, aren't we, with a circular stone door that rolled open and shut like a big wheel.
Yes, on a downhill ramp, so it was harder to open than it was to shut.
Now, the Gospels refer to the discovery of the empty tomb.
Yes.
And the earliest Gospel was written by Mark. That's the general consensus, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're not sure on the dating of the four Gospels, the four earliest Gospels, but at the moment the consensus is Mark, but in 20 years' time it may go back to one of the other ones. So.
I've started with him because that seems to be the consensus that he put the first version down in writing. And Mark became, if we just look at Mark for a second, he became a follower of Jesus a few years after his death, didn't he?
Well, there's a very good chance that Mark is and scholars differ on everything, otherwise they put themselves out of a job in many ways. But the consensus seems to be that when the young man who runs away naked on the night of Jesus' arrest, that was probably Mark of Jerusalem. So I think Mark was probably a follower of Jesus earlier. But a consensus for some time, and certainly one that I believe, is that Mark wrote as Peter's secretary. So that you've really got Peter's recollections. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that rather than the Christians slapping the big name on it, they slapped the lowly name of Mark on it, because they thought he was the guy who actually wrote it.
Do you think there's any reason why Mark didn't mention his personal involvement in this bizarre story? Of being the naked streaker?
Well, I think that John's Gospel, which I'm absolutely persuaded is by an eyewitness, also barely mentions himself. It is possible to write good testimony without constantly pointing to me.
Well, if we start with Mark's general sequence, he talks about death by crucifixion mid-afternoon. Mm-hmm. The body was taken down. It wasn't buried in a cemetery for prisoners or something like that. It was held by the Romans, and a friend of the deceased, a fellow called Joseph, not Jesus' dad, but another Joseph, approached Pilate and asked for the body. Yep. And Pilate allowed the body to be given to this man, Joseph, and then the body was wrapped in linen, was put straight into a tomb that this Joseph owned. And Mark refers to he doing it, but we can assume he had assistants.
And John mentions one by name.
Nicodemus, yes.
Yeah.
But to carry a body and to roll this door would take... So let's assume there were a few people.
And servants were cheap.
And then the door was rolled shut. Now, continuing with Mark's narrative, he then tells us that 3 ladies went to visit the tomb on the Sunday morning, and they were wondering how they would open up this door. But they found it already open. That's what Mark says, doesn't he?
The door was open for them, yeah.
That's chapter 16, verse 4. And inside there is no body of Jesus, but there is a man dressed in white. And he tells them that Jesus has risen.
Yeah.
So the ladies have discovered the door open and the body gone, and there's a man inside. And I'd suggest that there's nothing very supernatural about that so far.
No, that can mean all sorts of things.
And then people say, well, it's significant that the body had been wrapped in a linen cloth, and such a cloth was still in the tomb.
Yes, I think it is significant.
Firstly, we're not sure whether that cloth was the same cloth that had been around Jesus. The Bible doesn't give us any basis for knowing that, or it may be another cloth.
Could have been. Someone could have taken a second linen cloth in there for whatever reason. I guess so.
And you'd also agree that any self-respecting tomb robber would know how to unwrap the cloth from a body if they wanted to investigate it for artefacts or something like that.
Yes.
So continuing with Mark's story, the tomb's found open, the body's gone. Mark says nothing about the tomb being guarded, and Luke and John don't say anything about the tomb being guarded, but it's a significant part of your story, I assume, that Matthew does say a guard was placed on the tomb.
Yes, I mean, the trouble when you've got written reports is if they're honest, they're going to differ. They're going to include one thing and one's going to leave something out. So that's perfectly normal that certain things are left in and left out, as with any honest reporting. And you're right, Matthew's the only guy who mentions that there's a guard, but he also tells us that the guard didn't arrive until Saturday morning.
That's right, but it's certainly a significant part of your story that the body disappeared from a guarded tomb rather than an unguarded tomb.
Well, disappearing from any tomb is odd, but the fact that it's guarded makes it more difficult to believe that the Christians stole it and then made up the lie.
And you're right that Matthew does explain how the guard was organised the following morning.
Yeah.
So even on Matthew's version, the body could have been removed during the first night.
Absolutely. I mean, but the interesting thing, I think, if I can say something on that, is the interesting thing is, why does Matthew tell us? Why does he weaken his story by telling us that the guard doesn't arrive on Saturday? Frankly, if I was writing the Gospel, I probably wouldn't have mentioned that. And it's part of the thing with the Gospels is that they keep on giving you information that doesn't help their story.
But isn't this the line, Mr. Powell, that if they wanted to make it up, they could have made it up better?
Absolutely. I would have made up a better story than that.
If to some extent they were stuck with the inconvenient facts at the time,
Yes.
such as the tomb being discovered empty by women,
Yes.
then they could hardly write a different version.
I think you're right.
Decades afterwards.
I think you're right. I think that they were stuck with the fact this is not an unknown story.
So isn't the idea that if they wanted to make it up, they could make it up better? Totally logical.
No, because what I'm suggesting to you, Matthew says it happened the next morning. He could have just left that detail out. I'm suggesting one of the things that I find interesting about the Gospels is that they keep putting details in that actually make people go, what? So that the whole thing where Jesus meets people, a couple of people, and they don't recognise him straight off. Or the fact that the disciples keep doubting. I mean, right up to the end, the disciples are going, no. And so I think, yes, they are stuck with the reality, but they let us know it was Saturday morning. Matthew could have just left the time unstated.
And just misrepresented by omission that it might have been on the Friday night.
Absolutely. But see, it just shows, I think, the extreme integrity of the writers.
So on the version that we do have, it could have gone the first night or later if the guards were careless.
Or bought off or anything, yeah.
Or if they were incompetent.
There's a million possibilities for anything.
So just a couple more questions before I hand you over to Mr. Davidson. If your story is true and this corpse did come to life and somehow got itself out of the tomb, then you'd agree that that has never happened before or since in human history, as far as we know.
Yeah, in fact, if it was an everyday occurrence, if the world was a magical world where people were forever coming back from the dead, the whole point of Christianity is lost. What Christianity is saying is something really weird happened here. The body disappeared, and then he appeared to people who risked everything and lost everything to spread the story that you killed him, God raised him, we saw him.
We'll come to the subsequent appearances later, but dealing just with the aspect of the empty tomb for the moment, you're asserting a unique event in the way the body got out of the tomb. Absolutely. But I suggest to you that it has been known, for example, for human remains to be repositioned from one resting place to another. Mm-hmm. It's been known for guards to fail to do their duty.
Absolutely.
Through bribery or incompetence.
Absolutely.
It's been known for tombs to be broken into.
Yep.
Been known for bodies to be taken.
Yep.
And
I'm not sure of many. Bodies, apart from Victorian horror shows, things get stolen from tombs like treasures and that, not so much the body.
And do you agree that we even get stories about people who've apparently been dead for days coming back to life?
And I'm probably as sceptical of those as you are.
If you do a Google search on humans coming back to life from the dead, you'll get many, many entries.
Yes, and how many of those are accurate, I don't know. But I think, and there's been a lot of echo since then. But I think in history, certainly in terms of anyone of any substance in real history that people have bothered to check up, I'm not aware of many. So Moses stays dead, Muhammad stays dead, Buddha stays dead.
But you'd agree the other possibilities I mentioned about remains being repositioned or stolen, it's happened many times, hasn't it?
Well, I don't know how many times.
More than once.
Yeah, I'm sure it has. I imagine it has. But it's this particular body at this particular moment of this particular man who'd made certain claims. And then not just the fact that the body's missing. The body missing doesn't make Christianity. So when the body of Jesus goes missing, no one goes, resurrection. It seems that what the first Christian said was, those filthy mongrels who murdered him have now desecrated his grave. And it's only when he starts to appear and be touched by them that they go, oh, that's the disappeared body makes sense now because now he has appeared. So that you're absolutely right that the missing body is only a necessary part of the story. It's not the proof at all.
But not sufficient.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Powell, just finishing with the necessary but not sufficient condition of the missing body, why did you say it's an inconvenient, or did you agree it's an inconvenient fact that the the empty tomb was first seen by the women.
Yes, Mr. Hadley brought up that fact that, and I think it really is difficult for us to get the significance of this. And I must say, for me, it took me some years I couldn't work out why historians who drew attention to the women being the primary witnesses, the crowning witnesses, was so significant. Because although I am sexist, like I presume probably most men are, and have been brought up in a sexist culture, the way in which in the ancient world, we've got a number of writings that I won't bore you with quoting, which are quite clear that women cannot bear testimony in court. They are disqualified from bearing witness. And that the early Christians, when they sat down and wrote the accounts, all four of them start off with the women being the key witnesses, is a very substantial fact. And it was an embarrassment for the early Christians. The early Christians were mocked. Celsus, who was a second century critic of Christianity, speaks about the testimony of hysterical women. So yes, it's one of the things that indicates the probable honesty of these accounts.
Next and last, so we can get to our second topic, why did you say you're as sceptical as Mr. Hadley that Jesus was resuscitated?
Is that what I said? I think I'm sceptical of all sorts of claims about those sorts of things, and my tendency is to think when I hear a story of miracles to go, well, I'd be interested to know more about that. When I was an atheist, if you're an atheist, you have to take the position miracles don't happen, so any explanation is better than that. If you're like 90% of Australians, that you either believe that there is a God or there might be a God, you can then say, well, I'll have a look at the evidence. But I think generally speaking, I'd be sceptical of any claim to something miraculous, especially if it's then attached with a request for money.
I'm not entirely sure you answered my question.
Sorry.
Problem with a witness you're assisting. But in terms of scepticism about the claim that Jesus was resuscitated rather than...
as against rose from the dead. You mean
yes,
like
yes. So why were you expressing scepticism about the resuscitation theory?
I had a lecturer at Sydney University who wrote a large book arguing for a resuscitation of Jesus. There's been a number. There have been 3 or 4 attempts. The Passover plot was another one earlier in the 20th century. I think the notion that Jesus didn't die but swooned has been attempted off and on for a few hundred years, and quite a number of atheistic scholars, a guy called Strauss, has written the great mocking of it, that it's not just that Jesus died. It's not a Kerry Packer fell off the horse and was lucky the next ambulance had the zzz thing, where you're only your heart has stopped but your brain is thoroughly alive. But it's Jesus being brutally tortured to death and then dumped in a cave. The words they use in these books when they're trying to argue it is, in the cool of the cave, Jesus resuscitated, as if he had just a bit of heat stroke. But we only know of one man who was ever taken down from the cross alive. It was illegal, but one governor did it once. And of course, having been nailed and whipped, he did what you'd expect him to do, which is to die. So that the likelihood of someone who's been crucified coming back from the dead in the cool of the cave rather than the warmth of the emergency unit is ridiculous.
We'll move on to the second topic, Mr. Hadley.
Your story of the risen Jesus, Mr. Powell, involves Jesus getting out of the tomb and doing things for a few weeks until he ascended into heaven.
40 days, yeah.
And Paul wrote about this before the Gospels were written, didn't he? And his famous summary is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And you'd agree that this is the source for the people that say that Jesus appeared, quote, of above 500 brethren at once. That's 15 verse 6.
Yeah, the Apostle Paul's the only one who mentions that event.
When he says brethren, by the way, is he talking about only men? Was Jesus as sexist as you when his reappearances?
Do you mean was Paul a sexist, or do you mean Jesus only appearing to men?
Well, did the word brethren cover ladies as well?
I think it has in most cultures up until the last 20 years in the West. Even in France, it'll cover both.
Fair enough, 500 people then, okay.
Yeah.
And Paul adds that most of them are still alive.
Yes.
And you agree that preachers say this is significant because he's saying to the reader, well, look, you can check if you like.
Well, it seems to be that he's saying, having given the list of all these people who he appeared to and then mentions the 500 at one time, Some have died, though some are alive. It seems that he might be saying, if you wanted to. But we don't, that's only a supposition. Why he says that? Presumably because he's saying, well, if you want to check it. But we can't know for certain.
So the people that do say that Paul is inviting the reader to check, what they're really telling us is that Paul's saying to them, look, you people in Corinth, if you don't believe me, you can come down to Jerusalem and start asking about these 500 people.
That might be what they're saying.
It's
hearsay, though, isn't
hardly
it?
a practical proposition, is it, Mr. Powell?
No, but nothing hangs on it. There's nothing actually in what the gospel writers say that hangs on what some modern-day preachers say about a statement from the Apostle Paul.
So you're saying that you wouldn't degrade your interpretation of the story with the spin that Paul is saying, come and check?
No, but I think that might be what he was intending.
Now, Paul, of course, wasn't among these 500 people himself, was he?
I wouldn't have thought so, no.
In fact, doesn't verse 3 in this chapter tell us that all of the information he's repeating, so in other words, all the other appearances of the risen Jesus that he describes in 1 Corinthians 15, it's thanks to information that was passed on to him. So he's passing on what was told to him.
And he makes that explicit. He says, I handed on to you what I received. And what scholars like Gerd Ludemann, who's an atheist scholar on the resurrection, there's quite a lot of skeptic and atheists and Jewish scholars. They're not all Christians running around in this area. It's a reputable area of scholarship. Gerd Ludemann suggests, and there's almost an overwhelming consensus, that the Apostle Paul talks about going to Jerusalem where he received this thing about, I won't bore you with the details, but the scholarship's quite clear that he gives a summary of the Christian message, that he died for our sins, that he was buried, that he rose, that he appeared, then there's this whole list, there's general agreement that Paul received this summary of the Christian message that he says, I received it, I'm passing it on to you, about 4 years after Jesus died, which thoroughly puts to death the myth that Christianity evolved a sense of the resurrection of Jesus, that it was right at the very beginning. So yes, it is a thing Paul received from those who were there, and then he's passing on what he's received.
You'd agree that a lot of the commentary about the risen Jesus refers to this alleged historical fact of appearing to 500 people?
Some does. It doesn't have... It has almost no part in why I'm convinced that he rose and appeared.
You think it's more honest to identify this as something that Paul has received by way of hearsay from other people?
I think he says that he received it from others and he's passing it on. There's no secret about what he's doing.
So would you accept my observation that a lot of commentators have overlooked the fact that Paul identifies that this is information he's received from somebody else and was not in a position to check himself?
They might, but I don't think that's at the core of the reason why people are consistently being persuaded that Jesus actually walked out of the tomb alive and appeared to people.
So just considering that interesting proposition of an appearance to 500, you'd agree there's nowhere anywhere else that this is referred to, either inside the Bible or outside the Bible?
Well, not by the numbers. The Ian Powell theory, which is worth, a huge amount of money, is that it is probably the one where Jesus appears in Matthew's Gospel to a largest group in Galilee. And interestingly enough, what he says is, some worshipped, though some doubted. I think the extraordinary thing when you read through the Gospels is the way in which they seem to think doubting the resurrection is the most normal thing in the world. So in Luke, John and Matthew, you've got this constant thing about people seeing Jesus but still not really believing it. So I would think it might be the one in Matthew, but we just don't know.
Now with Paul's 500, there's no indication that any of those people wrote to anybody else about it, is there?
Well, we don't have any evidence, but the evidence you get from the ancient world is sort of, it's a bit of this and a bit of that, and most of it disappears.
There's no indication that any of those 500 people made any report to either the Jewish authorities or the Roman authorities at the time.
Well, we don't know. I don't know one way or the other.
And don't you think that the idea of an executed agitator being back in action would have been quite interesting to either of those groups?
Very interesting. It's why the early Christians, when they began preaching that, you killed him, God raised him, we've seen him, which was their sort of the mantra that they used in the first few sermons, were of tremendous interest to the authorities, and they got to work imprisoning, beating, and fairly soon after that the first Christian martyr, Stephen, died. So it was immediately terribly dangerous to be arguing that this crucified criminal was on the loose, because it indicated that, I don't know if the Romans cared much about it, but the Jews, because all the first Christians were all Jews, Jesus was Jew, the whole thing was happening in the Jewish world. The Jewish authorities were terrifically offended with the idea that they had put to death the Messiah. So they were very keen to shut the Christians down. And as you know, Saul, as far as we know, was the first organiser of a thoughtful, well-worked-out persecution until he says he also met Jesus.
So it seems to be emerging from these facts that Paul is describing, or at least referring to, a very, very significant event. And yet from the lack of repercussions, it seems that none of these 500 people were connected with the Roman authorities or the Jewish authorities. Now, when you look at it that way, doesn't this information given to Paul about 500 eyewitnesses start to look somewhat unreliable?
Well, I mean, you've got to... It may to you, but I just think for most people who come to the conclusion that the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that Jesus left it and then appeared to people, doesn't hang on the 500. It hangs much more on what's in John's eyewitness account and in Luke, who, again, one of the things that impressed me about Luke is if Luke was a dishonest man, because Christianity is either some sort of scheme and lies. If Luke's a dishonest man, he doesn't bother to say, I didn't see him, I'm an eyewitness. I mean, I talked to the eyewitnesses, but Luke says, he doesn't claim eyewitness credibility. He says, I talked to the eyewitnesses. There's this constant honesty about them, and it hangs much more on the Gospels than it does on Paul's recount. I'm not discounting Paul's thing. I just think it's a secondary thing rather than a primary. The primary things is the four Gospels.
But on either Paul's account, pardon me, or the four Gospels, or adding it all in together, we have an appearance of 500 people, which I mentioned because it's the biggest event. But there are a number of others to smaller groups.
Yeah.
Some outdoors, some indoors.
Yeah.
And it seems that neither the Jewish authorities nor the Roman authorities ever got wind of this at the time.
Well, I'm not an expert on what the Romans knew and didn't know. What we do know is that within 30 years, the Christians were causing sufficient trouble in Rome to be blamed for Nero's fire in Rome, as you know, is recorded by Tacitus, who's no friend. He describes Christianity as a pernicious superstition.
Tacitus disapproved of them because of what they believed, but he certainly didn't think those beliefs were true, did he?
No, but I'm saying that Christianity starts it's this tiny little thing, and I think it's hard for us to realise just how insignificant Christianity was in terms of numbers, and yet it has become, and moved fairly quickly, in the direction of becoming the largest movement in human history. And it's all based on the testimony of the witness who say, we saw him.
So the fact that a number of people believed, you say, is significant.
Can you ask that question again?
Well, you say that the belief of the disciples and then other people after the resurrection is a significant thing that we should notice.
that people were hearing the story in the very city where it happened. This is not like saying, you know, there was a resurrection in, I don't know, Kuala Lumpur, Timbuktu, thank you. So, you know, it's saying that the message of the resurrection of Jesus, his defeating of death, was in the city where it happened. And it's a small city. It's the size of Centennial Park.
Although at the time, most of the Jews didn't buy it, did they?
No, absolutely. And neither should they. If someone comes with a message of resurrection, it's best to keep our sceptical hat on. But in the end, thousands, within weeks of Jesus, you know, coming back to life and showing himself to his disciples, and these quite pathetic group of people now standing up fearlessly, being popped into prison and beaten and fairly soon killed, saying, you killed the Prince of Life, God raised him, we saw him.
So let's look at the significance.
Thousands in the end get persuaded, and it's the beginning of an extraordinary human movement.
Let's look quickly at the significance of that belief. Just bear with me, this may sound like a digression, but trust me. You've heard, I presume, of General Gordon of Khartoum?
I have.
He was sent to evacuate British citizens from an Islamic revolt in the Sudan.
Was slaughtered.
And for his trouble, he was hacked to pieces by the rebels.
I think it was Charlton Heston.
And they were following a person called Muhammad Ahmed, who had proclaimed himself to be a divine Islamic Messiah. Yeah? Yep. And eventually they were wiped out by Lord Kitchener. He's the bloke with the moustache, who had better weapons, and he cleaned up about 10,000 of them for the loss of about 50 British soldiers. So I presume you share my belief that the Mahdi, as he called himself, was not in fact a divine Islamic figure.
I'm not sure how you can be a divine Islamic figure, but I certainly don't share that view, yeah.
So isn't this an example, and there are many others in history, of that show us something about human nature, namely that being prepared to lay down your life for a belief does not prove the truth of the belief?
Absolutely. I don't for a second think that because someone dies for something, it's true. What it does show is it shows that you believe it's true. That's all it shows. And if I can pick up the story you've given, we know of quite a few movements of supposedly divinely inspired leaders around the time of Jesus, before and after, and throughout history. And when do they all come to an end? When the divinely appointed leader is executed by the Romans, who were very good at executing Jews at that time, and anyone who threatened their power. The thing that really is hard for us to realise how peculiar it is, that at the point when Christianity should have been wiped out, like a whole series of other movements in Palestine at that time, it exploded with power. And quite a number of historians who are not Christians, E.P. Sanders and others, will say, we need some explanation for this quite absurd thing that happened in history, that at the point when a movement should die, it grew, and it grew based on this statement, on one leg, we saw him risen, he's risen. And they weren't saying, therefore we can all relax about death. It wasn't then a statement about life after death. It was a statement about this man. And so I think the case you've given of the Mahdi, etc., is actually quite a good case of why Christianity is so different. That it says, who follows the Mahdi now? Nobody. He's just good for movies and interesting in history. But
Mr.
Jesus,
Davidson, thank you.
I'll be brief given our time, so just a couple of topics to touch on. The questions you were asked about Paul recording the appearances to 500 people, you gave an answer that Paul was passing on what he was told, and that you said that it was a summary that was about 4 years after Jesus died.
Some say up to 8, yeah.
Well, 4 or 8 years after, where did that occur?
Well, if you read the scholars who write in this area, they said that Paul made 2 visits to Jerusalem after he became a Christian. He became a Christian on his way to Syria, and then he returns to Jerusalem, which is the heart and centre of Christianity, and that's when he received this creed. It was an early Christian creed that summarised the great activity of Jesus in terms of death, burial, resurrection, appearances, and then he gives the list, so that it's in that period. And
that creed is passed on or is effectively recorded from 4 to 8 years after Jesus' death.
Yes, there's a little word "hoti" in it that is in many Christian creeds. It's a word "that," and it's a word that is used when people are summarising a set of beliefs, and so the scholarship is pretty much agreed that this is what Paul has embedded here, and he does this a few times. He quotes Psalms, he quotes hymns. In Philippians 2, he's got another one. He quotes earlier things, and they're of interest to scholars because they predate, even though 1 Corinthians is within 20 years of Jesus' life, it's even earlier than that. So it's showing that this is not a mythological development, but it's right at the origins of Christianity. It's about the resurrection.
Right. Then with the 500 that are questioned about, what significance do you say there is for the statement of that most of whom are living, although some have fallen asleep?
Well, I sort of agree with Mr. Hadley here that he may well be, or with the people that Mr. Hadley suggested, he may well be saying, you can go and check them. And to be fair, there was an enormous amount of movement around the Roman Empire, and so Christianity really got to Rome long before any apostles did, just by people trading and moving. So I think he's just saying yes. But again, I couldn't care in the sense if 1 Corinthians 15 wasn't saved for us, nothing hangs on it.
And after that 500, there's a reference to the unidentified 500, there's a reference to he appeared to James.
Yes.
Who's that, and what's the relevance of that?
Well, the interesting thing with that is that James, and again, it's one of the strengths and frustrating things about the eyewitness, or the eyewitness accounts and the ones by Luke, who's not an eyewitness and says he isn't, is that they leave out the stories they should include. Like, we know he appeared to Peter, we never have a description of it. James is the brother of Jesus, and we know from John's Gospel that the brothers of Jesus were not impressed by him and sort of almost mock him in John chapter 7, and yet James becomes a Christian after the resurrection. And we know in the writings of Josephus, who's a Jewish writer from that period, he speaks about the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. And so it is the resurrection of Jesus that seems to bring the brothers of Jesus into the disciples.
See the time.
So I think we have time for just a few more questions.
Or summary.
Summary. The most significant aspect of what this all amounts to is the effect it's had on humanity. And we know that people like Mr. Powell tell us that this is not just a question of an agitator being executed, but this was in fact a message from God of some importance to humanity. So it looks like we don't have time to put these questions to Ian, but I'd just like to ask you people to go away and ponder these issues. Think about the people and how they reacted to Jesus' message, or to these events, the significance of these events at the time. You've heard us discuss how most of the Jews at the time didn't buy it. Think about how long it took evangelists to make any headway in the surrounding non-Jewish countries. Think about the fact that since these events that we've been discussing today, only a minority of the world's population has accepted Christianity, and most of the world's population, at all times up until today, have adopted some other kind of religion. So I'd like you to consider this. Instead of Jesus being a successful divine minister, or a messenger, I should say, don't the facts point more towards Jesus just being another human victim of the immoral use of religious power when those authorities obtain the power to execute people? Thank you.
We accept that the claim that God raised Jesus from the dead is sufficiently out of the ordinary for there to be a sceptical examination of that claim. But not to say that resurrections can't happen because God doesn't exist and therefore Jesus can't have been raised from the dead, or to ignore the evidence. Now, the testimony of Mr. Powell today shows that after testing by a sceptical examiner, the bodily resurrection of Jesus is real history, and it's naive and dangerous to think the alternatives of hoax stand up to serious analysis. They're really put down to arguments about could-have-beens. Body could have been taken at an earlier time, or something could have happened. But the logical outcome of looking at what has happened and the authority for that, for this audience, is to accept that the resurrection occurred. So that's easy. If you had to vote, we don't have apparently a worm despite this modern group. You could all vote yes. But the more challenging issue for you, as it was for me as a know-it-all law student many years ago, when I first seriously examined the evidence, is what are you going to do about it? It seems to be common ground that Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection, and that Jesus existed and was crucified. And Mr. Hadley accepts, I think, that Jesus died at the Passover week. Perhaps uncertainty about the dates of birth and the dates of death, which don't affect the certainty of the death. We've got the missing body seems to be accept that the body's gone, and there's some could have been explanations for that necessary but agreed not sufficient condition for the resurrection to be history. the alternative explanations really don't add up to anything in terms of rebutting the eyewitness accounts of a number of people who had no particular motivation, if it was untrue, to risk death when they had been very anxious not to incur death before Jesus died. People like Peter denying Jesus and then changing his behaviour based on something, or James, the brother who didn't believe in Jesus, perhaps brotherly rivalry, which I have some experience of in my professional practice, and it keeps us working with a change after the resurrection experience, which is not something that I've experienced in my practice, as a vanishing corpse has not yet been in my inquest practice. So I'd urge you on this basis to accept that the resurrection of Jesus is history, and perhaps to do something about it.
Will you please join me in thanking Ian Powell and our learned barristers? I will dismiss the inquest in just a moment and allow you to consider your verdict. And I don't know if this is normal practice, but we do very much encourage discussion amongst your fellow jurors. So once again, thank you for being part of the inquest, and I'll now dismiss you.